So, hi, Matthew.
Hi,
Director at
Louisa.
the Buy-to-Let Broker. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got a lot to talk about. You and I have regular conversations and are pretty passionate about some of the changes that we're likely to see imposed upon the buy-to-let and the PRS community in general. So just wanted to cover off just a few bits and pieces, and then we can maybe just have a general chat. So the first one that's likely to hit us in the not too distant future is the Renters' Rights Bill. For those of you listening to the podcast, just a little bit of an overview of what the Renters' Rights Bill is likely to bring. So in a nutshell, the Renters' Rights Bill is the abolition of Section 21 and moving to Section 8. So Section 21 is no-fault evictions, which means that a landlord could evict a tenant for any particular reason. Whereas Section 8 is going to lead us into a situation whereby the landlord has to have a more meaningful reason to evict a tenant. So all very reasonable, it sounds on the surface of that. Also, within the Renters' Rights Bill, we're moving from arrears from 2 months. So a landlord could look for a possession order after 2 months in arrears. That's moving out to 3 months. These are proposals. Also, moving away from rents in advance. So a tenant could pay a rent in advance for a whole variety of different reasons. We're moving to just 1 month in advance, and we'll talk about what we think the problems that might bring. The tribunal service is going to be stood up to look at rent increases. And if a tenant has a problem with the rent increase, again, they can go to a tribunal. And also, tenants can basically ask to have pets in their properties, and landlords are no longer able to refuse a tenant who wants some pets. In addition to that, we've got decent home standards and RWAB's law, and those of them absolutely. Why should a tenant not have a decent place to live, a safe and decent place to live? So there's a few changes, and I suppose the clue's in the name around renters' rights and the impacts of some of these changes on tenants. So it's good of you to spend some time with us today, Matthew, and I know we have been pretty passionate about some of the conversations that we've had about this. So I suppose, in a nutshell, what do you think the potential changes, because they're still going through the Lords at the minute, but the potential changes, what do you think the impact might be specifically on landlords, and then maybe moving on to tenants? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, there's lots of changes. I mean, we are passionate about it. To give you an idea of how passionate I'm about this, today was a day that is my second year wedding anniversary. My wife asked me to take the day off, but I was more passionate about this, so I'm here. But it's all right. I'll refer it to yourself, Louisa.
Thank you.
I'm a great believer in balanced reform. I actually do not have a problem with the renters' rights, but I actually think it will, applied correctly, I think it will benefit both tenants and landlords long term. I think the biggest problem at the moment is landlords' perception rather than the reality of what it will change, and it has driven reticence within the landlord community, especially those that aren't necessarily as educated as they potentially should be on the changes that are there. But it's definitely going to have an impact. My biggest fear is that any impact it will have on the landlords will have an equal impact somewhere along the line on tenants, and ultimately, on a really basic level, if landlords continue to exit the market as they have done, then that in itself will have a huge impact on a private rented sector that was already creaking at the seams and is losing 10% of its stock seemingly year on year at the moment. So we've got significant problems. The actual reform itself carried a lot of good changes. One place I'd really like to start, because I'm really passionate about it, is Section 21, the removal of that, which I don't have a problem with, especially with how they're watering down Section 8 and how that will be applied. The biggest problem is Section 21 is considered no-fault eviction, and I think that in itself, as a phrase, the vernacular of no-fault eviction, which is being used mainstream now, is maybe underlines the stigma that the landlord already carries in our country, for whatever reason that is. And when we talk about no-fault eviction, we're talking about And all of this to me is not about protecting the landlord, protecting the tenant. It's just about having a working, efficient private rented sector that protects the most vulnerable within society. But if you look at it previously, I know part of the renters' rights bill, which we'll get to, is a change to periodic tenancies. But if we look at the moment, most tenancies are on a 6 or 12 month assured short hold tenancy agreement. That suits both the tenant and the landlord in a lot of cases. It gives the tenant that 6 or 12 months security, but doesn't tie them in so much that they no longer have the mobility to either move for jobs or school areas, catchment areas, etc. And it gives the landlord a certain amount of comfort around how long that tenancy is going to be in place. At the end of that tenancy, either tenants can sign another 6 or 12 months AST and extend that if both parties are happy, or if the tenant feels they want to move on, they're moving areas, they're moving jobs, they want to upsize, or if the landlord wants to do something different with the property, then they would serve a notice period, which is obviously increasing, which I actually agree with as part of the Renters' Rights Bill. But there'd be a notice period. But that is the contract that's been agreed. You both said yes, 6 or 12 months, and then we'll either extend it or we can roll month on month. And if both parties are happy with that, that's perfectly fine. So at the moment, you might sign a 12-month tenancy agreement with myself, Louisa. At the end of 12 months, you say, no, I want to carry on. Let's do rolling month by month. Month 15, you decide you want to move and upsize. You serve 1 month's notice, and that's the end of it. And that's happy, and we're both happy with that, and that's what we signed and agreed, or vice versa. I want the property back. If that's what's agreed and both parties were happy and it provided the security and the benefit and the flexibility to both parties, why, if the landlord wants that property back rather than the tenant wanting to move on, that becomes no fault eviction is beyond me. And that was the agreed contract. And it's and probably the most, to get people's heads around understanding this, because housing and homes is an emotive thing, and I think that's where this comes from, where people are being essentially removed from their home. But if I put it into a commercial perspective, if I was to sign a 12-month consultancy agreement with Paragon, and then we said at the end of that,
is that an invitation, or
yeah, I'd always support you, Louisa. But if we did a 6 or 12 months contract, and then at the end of that consultation period, we said, well, look, if the project's finished, we'll shake hands and go our separate ways. If not, we'll roll it on until that project's finished, as long as both parties are happy. We get to the end of the 12 months agreement. We both feel there's loose ends need tying up. We continue that for month 13, month 14. At the end of it, you go, well, do you know what? That's the project finished. Thanks for all your help, Matthew. Hugely appreciated. That we wouldn't turn around and go, no fault redundancy. That was the term and that was the agreement. And but that's the reality of it.
Same sentiment.
Yeah, but landlords they've signed a 6-12 month agreement. They want to do something else with the property, as long as they serve the proper notice. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be a longer notice period to allow people to move and protect homes, which is what we're talking about here. But it shouldn't be called a no-fault eviction. Whatever it should be called, it only emphasises it, and it creates huge problems where the landlords, again, from a journalistic point of view, from every perspective, they're seen as the bad guys in our country, in the UK, where reality is, most of the landlords are incredibly hardworking and provide a protective umbrella for society's most vulnerable, where the government it's not just at the feet of Labour. There's been 14 years of mismanagement from the Conservative government as well, but the government are falling woefully short of where housing needs to be, and so the PRS is needed more than ever before, and for whatever reason we're chasing landlords out of the PRS, and there doesn't seem to be a follow-on plan from the government to try and substitute that. There isn't enough social housing, there isn't enough corporate housing. So yeah, there's lots of things. I mean, we could probably break them down one by one, but my first thing is, no fault evictions and Section 21. I have no problem with the removal of it, but we need to start looking at landlords for what they are, and we need to look at the PRS for what it does, rather than the current stigma they have in society at the moment.
We know that the social housing waiting list is 1.3 million households on the social housing waiting list. And we also know from stats that are, easily available, that there's actually more possession orders and evictions in the social housing arena than there is in the private rental sector. So actually their problem is getting worse against a backdrop of a, non-provision of appropriate housing. And if landlords do elect to leave the sector because it's just getting that little bit too hard, then that's just going to exacerbate the issue completely. One of the things within the Renters' Rights Bill that I'm pretty passionate about is rents in advance. And this is where we're moving from an unlimited number of months rent in advance to 1 month's rent in advance. And on the surface of it, you think, well, that's actually pretty fair. And, why should a tenant pay to secure a property in advance? I think where it unravels is where you've potentially got a tenant that has either poor credit history or no credit history, or is coming to the country fresh, or maybe is a student who wants to pay out the whole of their student loan in advance to secure their property. So I think where we've probably got a situation is that if I was a landlord, for example, and I have 15 households queuing up for my one property, which is fairly typical nowadays, and I have a family that has either poor credit history or no credit history versus a family or an individual that has a really good squeaky clean credit history and has the ability to prove their willingness and ability to pay their rent, as a landlord, the likelihood is I'm probably going to go with that potential tenant who has a really clean credit history. Now, the way of getting over that historically would have been that, tenant A, who maybe doesn't have a good credit history, could say, well, I'll pay you 6 months in advance to secure the property. And then suddenly they're on the same level playing field as the person that's got a clean credit history who isn't going to pay anything in advance. So by removing that ability to pay in advance, it kind of feels like that particular tenant is going to be disadvantaged and potentially selected against in light of that, of removing that. Do you have any sense on that, Matthew? Is that, do you think differently, or what's your thoughts on it?
No, I think you're 100% right. I think with any legislative change, we should be looking at what's it there for and who's it there to protect. And I think you've absolutely got it right. I mean, all avenues fall back to a shortage of housing, not just in the PRS, but a shortage of housing. If there was enough housing, that wouldn't create a problem. But where we've got, as you quite rightly said, I mean, you've said 15 people per property. You see varying figures of that. The last Zoopla figures I saw was 21 people per property on the rental market. But we can both agree it's somewhere between 50 and 20 people heading for each property on the rental market. So as a landlord, that's obviously great news, because you get to pick which is the most suitable tenant. And you would like to think out of 20 potential tenants, you would see at least 4 or 5 that you would think would be fantastic tenants. Naturally, that's going to lead to people, as you quite rightly say, whether it's the best credit record, whether it's the highest income earners, whether it's a combination of, it's going to make landlords naturally pick towards the best tenant, or what they perceive to be the best tenant. That's going to leave the people who are most vulnerable in society, whether they're the people who are forced to live from benefits, whether that's single parents, whether that's maybe on a more basic level, people who've just gone self-employed, who've been made redundant in the challenging economic vista and just gone self-employed. But it's going to make it very difficult for them, as you quite rightly said, the one way around that with advanced rental payments, whether that's 6 or 12 months. And although in isolation, if the policy is just taken in isolation, it can kind of make sense, I think no one's followed through with what the impact of that will be. And dare I say it, that's almost typical of the government's current decision-making process on these things, of they're not looking at what the ripple effects of that are. And maybe without being too harsh, I don't really know how else I can paint it. It shows sort of how out of touch with reality of how these things work they can be at times. And yes, I agree with you. All you're going to have is the shortage of housing. So what you're going to find is a portion of people are left without housing, and who are they going to be? They're going to be the least attractive tenants for the landlord, and that's going to be the people with poor credit profiles, the single parents, the people on lower incomes, the people with poor credit records. You know, a lot of people now will rent by choice. Let's not get round like it's no longer sort of everyone wants to own their own home, or certainly not at a certain age brackets. But without a doubt, the private rented sector houses nearly all of society's most vulnerable. And if we don't protect them, and if legislation or changes in legislation have the opposite effect, then that's a huge problem.
You're absolutely right. And your average first-time buyer now is 37. So you're right. The most vulnerable in society are likely to be housed within the private rental sector, and within the social housing sector, but also, like you said, by choice. We've got affordability constraints on lending, and we've had that since just after the credit crunch, and that hasn't changed up until recently. There's been a little bit of movement within that residential space. But you're absolutely spot on. The rental world works really well for a sizable chunk of today's society, including the 5 million additional people that we're inviting to the country between now and 2032. Going back to my point about credit history, the chances are that if we are bringing new people into the country, the chances are they probably don't have a credit history. And again, they may well be disadvantaged against as a result of not being able to prove their ability to maintain rental payments. So I think, ultimately, if we haven't got a problem now, which we know we have because there's a certain supply-demand mismatch, we're building up a much bigger problem going forward without any changes to the Renters' Rights Bill as it stands. I mentioned decent home standards. If we look at the private rental sector, the standards within the private rental sector have improved massively over the last 10 years, so that we've only got a relatively small proportion of properties that actually don't meet the decent home standards. And I think that's testament to the fact that landlords do want to work with their tenants and to do offer, a decent level of accommodation for tenants. Again, similarly within the social housing arena, that's improved, but they too still have the same problems. And Awad's law, why would you not implement Awad's law, is absolutely the right thing to do. We've also got pets on the agenda, of course. We've got landlords who are no longer allowed to refuse a pet, but going back to our 15 to 21 tenants waiting for every new property, if there's a pet involved in that as well, they might again be discriminated against as a result of that. So I think irrespective of whether that rule is implemented, it probably won't make much difference. And of course,
No,
the tenant
I
has to
agree.
take out
Yeah.
insurance.
Yeah, I agree. On terms of pets, I'm not, I don't think that piece of legislation will move the needle either way in respect of whether landlords want to stay in the market. But I agree with you, it's not one that really can be policed while there's such a discrepancy between supply and demand. Exactly what you say, ultimately they're going to pick the ones without, where maybe it will have a small impact, but not enough to push the needle, would be where an existing tenant that was in the property requested to have a pet. A landlord wouldn't be able to say no within the terms of that agreement. Now, the most it could do is eventually serve notice on them. It's interesting when you mention the decent home standard, and it has improved. The standard of property within the PRS has improved dramatically. We've both, without giving away ages, been in the market long enough, and over a period of time seen a huge dramatic improvement in the standard of homes across the sector, especially in multi-occupancy as well, I must say, where it's probably seen the biggest difference. But it's interesting what's pushing that. I actually see sort of contrasting forces pushing against each other in that. I think most landlords inherently are good. They see it as business, and they want good homes. I think most landlords want to do a good job. If you look at most of the landlords we deal with, most what you would deem not professional landlords, as in they live off the rents, but large property portfolio landlords, most of them have their own business. They don't use the rents. They've made their money from having successful businesses, and property is just one area where they want to diversify their capital. It's mainly inheritance and legacy planning. So they want to leave good properties, good stock to their children and to their sort of as part of their legacy, and they want to create good homes. I mean, it's something like 60%. You might correct me on this. It's something like 60% of properties within the PRS are unencumbered. It's something
60.
around that figure. Yeah, it's been pretty static on that. But more and more, as more people have entered into the market, more and more will be becoming financed. As soon as properties need to be financed, then they have to be valued by mortgage lenders, and that in itself helps maintain standards. If we push leveraged property out of the market, which is what some of the changes over the last few years, and especially since the Trust Quartang budget, has had an impact with a lot of leveraged property sort of exiting the market, then there's a danger that some of those standards drop. There's always going to be poor landlords, like there will be poor lawyers, and there'll be poor doctors, and there'll be bad underwriters, dare I say, and bad mortgage brokers, and whatever they may be. But generally speaking, the standard is good. But having more of the stock in the PRS financed has definitely improved the standard. I also think, again, everything goes back to not being enough stock. If there's enough stock in the market, then that in itself increases standards, because tenants have choices. And if your stock isn't of the right choice, of the right standard, then they're going to go and pick a different property. Part of the problem now, we go back to whether it's 15 or it's 21 people per property. People are just desperate to secure housing for their family, and that allows the less scrupulous landlords, which there will be some, to not need to maintain the stock at the same level to create demand. It all comes back to creating the right level of stock, and not just within the PRS. If we have a healthy, a healthy housing market has obviously a large tranche of home ownership. It has a healthy tranche of private rented sector property. It will have a large tranche of social housing, which we don't have enough of, and the government is doing nothing really to address that to the level it needs to, and can't afford to maintain or build that stock, and a large portion of corporate housing. Then between all of them, they also it keeps a healthy balance on house prices, but it keeps a healthy balance on standard of housing, because if the standard of housing, the PRS drops, people will move towards corporate housing or social housing, and vice versa. And so enough stock, and if it's balanced in terms of ownership status, and where it sits in itself, it almost self-polices standards to a certain degree. But right now, all we've got is not enough people can own their own home because of the reasons we've said. The private rented sector is woefully lacking. The social housing sector is woefully lacking. There's not enough there. And so essentially that, even though that isn't what the stats are saying, though, that will allow, maybe longer term, if we don't address these issues, for some of those standards of homes to drop again, which is not what we want, especially where we've come over the last decade.
Well, I think obviously the Renters' Rights Bill, within that is the landlord database as well. So landlords have to input all of the details, including property details, on the database, and if they don't, then they stand to have a fine. And that's fine. That's absolutely great, and that's how it should be. And there should be some level of transparency for both landlords and tenants as part of that database. My concern over the database is exactly what you've just said. In an environment where we've got a supply-demand mismatch, and you've got tenants that are desperate to find somewhere to live, what is the chances of them actually whistleblowing on a landlord who may or may not be on that database? And I think we've got a problem with that, and because the oversight and the policing of that database is going to be really difficult. We have been, fighting's the wrong term, but we've been actively seeking an opportunity to be part of that database as a lender community, because you could or couldn't use it as part of your underwriting decision making if you wanted to do, but if nothing else, you've got visibility of the type of landlord that you're dealing with, as to whether or not there's been any issues with them in the past, etc. So I think that database is going to be really helpful. but a bit like the court reform and the lack of resource and support in overhauling the courts, you're probably going to have the same problem with the database. It kind of feels to me, all of this feels very much we're trying to implement something that's maybe a little bit too ahead of itself because of all of the infrastructure challenges that we've got. We're trying to implement something that maybe in 4 or 5 years' time, when we've got more social housing, when we've got, an improved court system, and we've managed to build out all of the infrastructure, would be the right time to implement the Renters' Rights Bill, whether it be in its current guise or whether it be in a slightly different guise. But it kind of feels like we're just a little bit too premature with this and the implementation of this, whenever that may or may not be. But it looks like it's probably going to be the latter part of this year. So Renters' Rights Bill, we've kind of done that. We think ultimately it's probably not going to impact our landlords particularly, but it's probably going to have a greater negative impact on tenants.
Yeah, I mean, it maybe goes a little bit off tangent, but just something you've said there, which is really pertinent in terms of, you're kind of alluding to, is this bill being sort of pushed in too quickly? Is it being rushed in to a certain degree? Not because it's not needed, but more because is the infrastructure there around it? And part of the problem you've got is obviously you've got a government here that's trying to implement it during its tenure. There's an argument, I believe, and I don't know, maybe it's a little bit too much of a utopia. I don't actually know whether it would work or how it would work or how it would be implemented, but whether housing is so fundamentally important to, well, not just the UK, but to any country, whether it should be sort of rise above party politics, and whether there should be almost a central body or think tank that deals with housing, so we don't just have sort of an average of a new housing minister every year and sort of new governments coming in and changing everything from scratch, because we're rushing this in. Whereas if we were just looking at the shape of housing and how to tackle these challenges over the next 20, 30, 50 years to make the UK a better place to live, rather than trying to rush it in within a tenure of a government's 4 or 5 years, and then maybe we'll be looking at things in a much better way, and maybe in fact some of the things we're looking at now actually would have already been introduced because it would have been looked at differently previously. It's just something to think about. How that would work, I don't know, but maybe housing shouldn't actually be something dealt with by individual government parties and should be more centralised. But I don't know what your view on that is.
Yeah, spot on. I think the fact that this is a junior ministerial role anyway, it's so incredibly important to the UK, and it's a junior ministerial role, and every time we see a new minister, it's because they've been promoted out of their junior ministerial role. So at the very basics, you should make it a more senior role. But I think you're right, this needs to come out of government and maybe go into the bank, or maybe go into Treasury, which will still be aligned to government anyway, but to a lesser degree. I think you're absolutely right. The civil servants will have a lot to do with this, but they move, with the government anyway, so they will be influenced by that government. So I think it needs to be a standalone proposition, in effect, to help to support the housing agenda. But as a very basic minimum, move it from a junior ministerial post to a more senior post.
No, you're exactly right. One of the problems with it being a junior post is anyone who comes in and is effective within their role is then removed from that role, and that's the problem. So you can, you're only going to get consistency there if someone comes in and does a poor job, and there fundamentally is something
that's not what you
wrong.
want.
Yeah, no, exactly. But it is that's the irony of it is we're only going to see consistency if someone's consistently poor at what they do, and that's probably never going to work in any commercial environment. Would never work in in the private sector. So why we expect it to work in government and the public sector, I wouldn't know.
Spot on. Should we move over to EPCs, Matthew? Because this is another burning challenge.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking about the Renters' Rights Bill, and I became really passionate about that. And I kind of feel like it's now been overtaken by the EPC consultations, of which there are two. So there's the EPC reform, and I think most people would agree that actually EPCs, they're a bit of a blunt tool. They're probably not fit for purpose, but they're all that we've got at the minute. And so everybody is aligned to what that EPC tells us. But I think everybody would also be aligned to the fact that they're probably not the right tool to use, or they do need a bit of an overhaul. So that's one consultation, which is the EPC reform. It's going to work its way through this year, and then any changes will be implemented in 2026. Now, that in itself, I think, is fine, and I think everybody can live with that. But then quickly off the back of EPC consultation for reform, you get the EPC consultation for standards. And this is the one that's keeping me awake at night, particularly because this is the piece around just for the private rental sector. We're only looking at the private rental sector because that only makes up 20% of all of our housing stock. But actually, it's deemed to be a massive issue. So we're just looking at the private rental sector. And what we're saying is that all houses within the private rental sector, if they have new tenancies, have to have an EPC A to C rated property by the end of 2027. And if it's an existing tenancy, all of those properties need to be upgraded to EPC A to C by some point in 2030. Now, crude maths, and this is fag packet maths, but it's courtesy of some of my colleagues at Nationwide, so I'm going to bank that one. They are suggesting that 2,000 properties per day from last week, so it'll be more than that now. So 2,000 properties per day, and this is not working day, this is actual number of days, would need to be upgraded every day to hit those deadlines. And we've got around 55% of all the private rental sector have got a D or worse rated property. So the size of the task is enormous. The dates are now, if you look at what the Conservative government ditched to what the Labour government are looking to implement, the actual timelines from the consultation date being released to the date in which they're looking for all these improvements to be made is actually shorter. We've got a shortage of tradespeople, which we know. There's probably about 250,000 new tradespeople that we need to bring in to be able to improve these properties. And also we're building 1.3 million new homes, and we're building social housing, and they're all using the same tradespeople or retrofitters or the same EPC consultants or everybody else. It's the same group of individuals that are going to have to make these changes. So, as I say, I was really passionate about the Renters' Rights Bill and the implications of that. And then we move on to EPCs. So I'll stop talking for a moment there, Matthew, but I'll probably interrupt you because I am quite passionate about this. Yeah. But what's your thoughts on the new EPC potential legislations following the consultation?
I mean, honestly, we could probably do a podcast at the end of the day on the EPC because there's so many different aspects and facets to it that need consideration. One, is it the right thing to do? Can it be implemented with the stock type we have in the UK? Secondly, can it be done within the timeline? Thirdly, what's the cost of that? And then how is the cost of that funded? And they're all huge, huge problems. So I'll just address a few of them, and then you can interrupt me at will because there's so much we could discuss in it. But one of the fundamentally the biggest problem we have is the UK has the oldest housing stock in Europe. Okay, and traditionally speaking, and there has been a change of this since obviously these EPC changes were first sort of discussed by Rishi Sunak's government, so there has been a fundamental change which we'll get to, but traditionally speaking, character sort of Georgian Victorian houses were the staple sort of buy-to-let properties, so the ones that naturally aren't modern method of construction and would fall foul of the EPC. there's huge problems. As you've said, the numbers don't stack up. There aren't enough tradespeople. We're not going to have enough tradespeople, and that's before we take into account those same tradespeople are going to be needed to increase the property stock across the UK anyway. It's not practical. Now that creates a problem. One of the reasons why the Conservative government ditched this was because of those timescales. It just wasn't going to be achievable. So what's going to happen? So we come to the end of 2027, it comes to the beginning of 28, which is not far away. And suddenly there's lots of property that can no longer be rented out as part of the private rented sector, supposedly. Come 2030, that's all tenancies, right? So you take it away from the problems for the landlords. Let's put it in the lender's perspective. Suddenly a lender has a huge amount of stock on its book that it's lent on, that's been underwritten on the basis that, to really simplify it, but it's been underwritten on the basis that one way or another it becomes self-financing. The rental income generated will fund that investment property. In other words, a landlord, doesn't matter what his income is, it's not there to afford 13 mortgages or 20 mortgages or whatever is in his portfolio. And suddenly he's no longer allowed to rent this stock. So from a lender's perspective, are we just going to see default sort? Because landlords are traditionally asset rich, but cash poor. They can't afford to pay all the mortgages. We saw this in COVID with all the mortgage holidays when people weren't paying rent, understandably, under the circumstances. Huge problems. Not only that, it also removes a huge amount of stock overnight from the private rental sector that can be let. So there's an even bigger housing shortage than the crisis we're already in. And then we come to cost. The cost of it. I mean, the government estimation is, I think, something around about an average of 6.5k per property to upgrade to EPC or above. Well, the average air source heat pump, I believe, is about 14k. Double glazing on average, I mean, it's obviously very property dependent, but if you look at a typical buy-to-let, it's probably 7 to 10k realistically. If you were to put new insulation in a property, it's probably going to cost on average 2, 3, 4k. There's no way, I don't know where those figures come from. I genuinely don't know where they come from, but there's no way the average property is going to be upgraded for 6k. It's not. It's just not. But even if we take those figures, let's just take them as they are. And let's say the average portfolio landlord has 8 to 10 properties. Well, suddenly they've got to find an additional, whatever it may be, 60k. And I think it'll be double that to upgrade all their properties, right? They don't just do that. Now, I think when these changes were first sort of obviously being discussed, it was, again, pre the Trust Kwarteng budget of September 22, and we didn't necessarily have the leverage issues across a lot of the stock we have now. So I think the perception was, well, don't worry, the landlord will raise extra money against the property when they come to refinance, will take a further advance. Part of the problem we have now, because the landlords don't have the cash to do this, so part of the problem we have now is the fact that most people who've got leverage stock are leveraged to what is capacity in terms of stress rates and ICR rates. So that puts lenders and landlords in a really difficult position. Could lenders have an agreement with the PRS and the PRA and the FCA in respect of allowing a more lenient leverage if further advances or borrowing additional monies to get a property to EPC or above? Potentially, but then that creates mortgage prisoners, because they're not going to then be able to go back to market and remortgage elsewhere, and that creates fundamental problems with just kicking the can down the line. I've done a lot of work on this historically, as you know, Louisa, we've discussed it a lot. Unsecured finance options for landlords. There isn't suitable options right now that are there. Second charge loans, again, will create mortgage prisoners, and it's very clunky. Are people going to want to generate 20 secured loans with the large fees involved and valuations and legals just to get some works done. Any down valuation, suddenly can't get the level of works done. All of these things create fundamental problems. And as you said, take away from all of that, there's going to be further reform. What's compelling a landlord to make those changes now? And it might not even be EPC standards. By the time this implementation comes in, it might be something completely different. And they go and spend 10k a property getting all these properties up to EPCC, because a lot of these properties, the older stock, will never get to B or A. And then the measurement changes from EPC to something else, and some of these properties fall short and they have to get more works done, additional works done. It's just, I hate using the word, but honestly, I think in terms of minimum energy efficiency standards, I think it's a shambles. I think it's a shambles, and I think I think the Conservative government did right to step away from that. I'm not saying we shouldn't be working towards it. We should be working towards it, but setting unrealistic guidelines when we don't have the tradespeople, we don't have the people to go out and do the measurements. We don't even know what those measurements will be, and landlords physically don't have the money to do it. And all we're doing is creating a huge black hole where we're going to have, or a huge cliff edge where we're going to have landlords unable to let stock, a massive reduction overnight in PRS stock, which we can't afford and the government can't afford. And it's also going to create a huge problem for lenders, where they've got lots of stock on their book that can't be let out, that's been underwritten on that basis. Do we suddenly see default rates? And then obviously the secondary and impacts of that are absolutely huge. So yeah, I sound almost doomsday mongering by saying that, but I think that's how much of a shambles the minimum energy efficiency standards sort of deadlines are.
I won't disagree with anything that you said, and I think that's certainly the feedback that we're giving. So we're giving that within the consultation. We'll be speaking to ministers in the same way as we did within the Renters' Rights Bill. I managed to corral some enthusiasm from some of the members of IMLA, so the trade body, and also UK Finance are quite passionate about this as well. So it's good that we're starting to see a bit more ground force in support of pushing back against this consultation. I think also 22% of all stock within the PRS is leasehold. So how is that going to be worked? Because you know yourself, if you've got a freeholder and a leaseholder, is a leaseholder going to let them stick a great big solar panel on the side of the flat, or a heat pump? Is that going to work? And if you're in a top floor flat and you decide to have cavity wall insulation fitted, the ground floor flat's going to be super warm as it's all falling down. So I think there's so many of these things. Clearly they're talking about exemptions, and they're talking about, again, within the Conservative government potential legislation, it had an exemption of £10,000. The new legislation is proposing to be at £15,000. So, what it doesn't say is, if the landlord spends £15,000, is that the maximum they're going to have to spend, or do they not have to spend anything to actually apply for the exemption? The only grants available, green grants available, are available based on tenancies. So based on the actual tenant as opposed to the landlord or the property. So again, that probably isn't going to work. So they need to think about whether or not there's any green home grants that could be afforded to some of these landlords. But I think the thing that gets me more than anything else is that this is only 20% of the housing stock. So the impact, even if we did this, and we could do this, the impact that it's going to have on the overarching challenge is going to be minuscule by comparison to the 67% of owner-occupied houses that not even started to discuss this change in legislation. So that's a bit that frustrates me, because for landlords, they've had the changes in taxation. They've got 169 pieces of legislation at the moment. They've had interest rate increases. They're going to have the Renters' Rights Bill. All of these are compounded into a landlord thinking, do you know what? Actually, if I wasn't going to retire, I might well retire. So the larger landlords of some, we have quite a lot of them because, of course, we've been around for almost 40 years. So we've got a lot of landlords that have worked with us for a long period of time. Are they then going to start to say, well, actually, this is just not going to work for me, and my children don't really want to inherit it, so my succession planning is not going to work. What's going to happen to those properties? What's going to happen to those landlords? So I think what we're looking at is pieces of legislation in isolation, but actually the compounded issue for landlords in particular is I'm not going to catastrophize this, because I don't want to do, because I think that there are some elements of this that can work very well for the private rental sector, but I think it's the
But there are dangers of it being
challenges.
catastrophic. I mean, that's the reality of it. There is, it's funny you're talking about real long-term impacts, but we're beginning to see that now. So I kind of alluded to it in the fact that, most of our landlords, this is legacy inheritance planning. They don't need the money day on day. It's about sort of creating long-term investments for their children. We're now seeing landlords, as you are seeing as a lender, selling their limited company, selling their stock, because the children actually don't want that. It's actually seen now, rather than that the children would rather have the cash. I think as inheritance, that they see almost inheriting a portfolio as a burden now. And we're actually seeing lenders change criteria on the back of that now. So a number of lenders now are looking at effectively lending where someone is buying a limited company, in other words, the whole portfolio, rather
Paragon
than
included.
just that Paragon included. I didn't know if I was allowed to plug, but
You're very, very well.
but the fact Paragon are doing that, it's fundamentally showing that these changes are already beginning to impact. And as you said, in isolation, every one of these legislative changes, dating all the way back to the tax changes that was a Conservative introduction. George Osborne made the announcement in July 15, moving on to the PRA changes in how landlords and portfolios need to be underwritten, which I, for the record, agreed with, even though it created commercial challenges. I agreed with the PRA changes, less so with the tax changes. And then obviously we've had changes in HMO legislation, which I agree with, and then obviously, but now we've got the renters' rights, we've got the EPC standards, all of these things compounding one on the other. Eventually, it's just tapping away at the landlord until it breaks. There has to be a reason for landlords to want to invest in the private rented sector. And if the government keeps removing those reasons, and on top of all these reasons to want to walk away is diminishing margins, consistently diminishing margins, if the government keep removing these reasons, and if the margins for and the reasons for landlords want to continue to diminish, then ultimately the government has to find a way of replacing the private rented sector, and right now they seem so far away from that.
I think you're absolutely right. We need to encourage. I mean, we actively encourage new landlords, as do some of our other, my other lender colleagues. We're actively trying to encourage new landlords into this, and yields still pretty strong. We still see, some in particular up in the northeast and northwest, the yields are stacking up, but they're stacking up on properties that are your 2 up, 2 down terrace type properties, that are likely to fall foul of some of these legislative changes. So they're working really well as it stands at the minute. But what's the longevity of these things? So I think we're facing into quite a lot of challenges, and I always try to put a positive slant on this, and I do think that there is an element of positivity, in particular with the Renters' Rights Bill. I think that can play out well, providing it's implemented in an effective manner. I think the EPC consultations, I do genuinely believe that any government worth its salt will really think this one through and see whether or not it's actually doable. And I think in its current guise, it isn't. I do think that they are talking to the industry, which is great, because within the Renters' Rights Bill, they didn't want to liaise with the industry particularly. But I think within the EPC consultations, they are. So I think that's quite helpful. I think the changes around the EVs that came out, so that pushed the sales of, petrol and diesel cars back to 2035. which I think is a good step in the right direction towards something around EPCs. And that might be that kind of forces their hand in the same way. I think they pointed that at Trump and what he's doing over in the States, but I think we can
if that's
point
our
that
benchmark, we've got some problems, Louise.
What?
if Trump is our benchmark, yeah,
I think
the
you're
problems
right.
are further reaching than we thought.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I do, but everybody needs somewhere to live. There is a supply demand mismatch. So, there is a point in time where a landlord can still make a decent living, providing they tick all of these boxes. And the problem is that the size of the properties within the private rental sector that can tick all of these boxes is going to shrink if we enforce some of these changes as radically as we're talking about. So, and I'll get off my soapbox now, Matthew, but I'm mindful of your wedding anniversary.
No, listen, that's absolutely fine. I'll still be working all day. I chose not to take the day off, so I'll be working all day as usual. But there is a positive spin to it, I think, and I mean that sincerely. All the changes over recent years have professionalised the market. That's only a good thing. It's polarised the market. We have seen huge improvements in standards, and what's left standing are professional, committed landlords. I agree with all of that wholeheartedly. The yields are there. Landlords are benefiting from these wonderful yields. But what we remember is why those yields are there at the moment. They're there because of the shortage of stock and the problems and the people have been forced out.
Yeah.
But there is a cap to that. I think there's a tipping point, which we're probably not far off. If you look at the rate at which rents have increased, and I know it's a little bit geographical, but if we look at an overall, as an aggregate, if we look at the rates that rents have increased, there's a tipping point where if they're pushed any further, even if it's market demand that pushes it further, there's just larger default rates and they don't get paid and it's not affordable. And we're probably getting close to that now. So I think all these diminishing margins have been offset a little bit, delaying the impact by these increasing rents. But if we don't address all these issues now, if the government doesn't listen to sort of the information that the industry is giving through people like you, and you've done a wonderful body of work on that. But if it doesn't continue to listen, then those rents can't increase any further, and that's where the problem will go. Rents have probably increased as much as they can realistically. And now we're going to see a more realistic relationship in terms of rents with general inflation and wages. I don't think there's any more capacity for that really in the main. But I do think there's there are lots of things to be positive in terms of how lenders are addressing this, how lenders are being innovative, like Paragon are in the more innovative lenders are, the more options specialist brokerages like ourselves can offer to our landlords. The more options landlords have, the more likely they are to stick about in the market. And the more landlords there are in the market, the more housing there is for tenants. And as I say, all of this comes back to protecting the people within the private rented sector, which are the most vulnerable. So there are lots of reasons to be positive, but the government has to listen and the government has to act, and there has to be more realistic, whether it's the speed at which they bring in the rent reform, whether it's the speed they bring in the EPC changes. There just needs to be an element of common sense attached to it, and not one-dimensional thinking, but rather than, okay, if we introduce it, and if we introduce it within these timelines, how achievable is this through resource, through time, through cost, through people's ability to make those changes, and just make sure that it's any of these changes, they're all going to be good for the industry longer term, but they have to be practically achievable as well.
I was actually going to ask you about, what would be your ask or your call to action? And I think you've already answered that for me, which is absolutely spot on. So I think for me, my ask or call to action is anybody can respond to the EPC consultation. It's not an enormous challenge and it's not a big ask. And I would ask anybody who has the willingness or desire to respond to the EPC consultation, they should, in particular if they've got some evidence that they can share with the government. I think that's really important. We'll continue to fight the good fight as we do. I'll continue to have sleepless nights as I do, and I'm sure you will as well, Matthew. Despite the number of hours that you work during the course of the day, I'm sure that they keep you awake during the course of the night as
Absolutely.
well. But I'm really grateful for you spending some time with us today. Hopefully it's been useful. As I say, there are some positives that come out of both of these two potential legislations, but they just need to be implemented in the correct manner that's going to help and work for the whole of the private rental sector. So thank you, Matthew. I really do appreciate you spending time with us, and happy anniversary. And please apologise from me to your wife.